Welcome to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and today we're going to be finishing our special series on Alzheimer's care and swallowing problems. So this is part 4 of a 4-part series where we're talking about maximizing independence in eating. In part 1, I talked about the basics of swallowing problems, or dysphagia, which is the medical term. In part 2, I talked about how to modify textures as well as build flavor when you have to do that. And in part 3, I talked about different types of adaptive equipment that could be helpful to maximize someone's independence with eating, which leads us into more strategies to do that. So the first thing to keep in mind are kind of the basics when you're offering feeding assistance to someone with primarily with Alzheimer's disease. You need to sit with that person if at all possible, and making sure that you're eating together, because I don't know about you, but if I'm sitting at a table with someone who's not eating food, then either I want to try to give them some of my food, or I don't feel much like eating because they're not eating. And so one part of the brain that remains intact with Alzheimer's disease is people will imitate what we do. And so if we're eating, then they know it's time for everyone to eat. So also making sure that you make eye contact with them and that you offer verbal and visual cues. So that's why them seeing you eating, that's really great to do. And then if they need a little bit of help, you can offer an additional sensory motor cue through the different hand feeding techniques that we'll talk about in just a second. And the final thing, kind of the final basics of providing feeding assistance, is that you want to offer small amounts of food, but at a slow and consistent rate. And in addition to that, making sure that you know what foods they like, and that you're not overdoing it with your assistance. So if they can eat independently for part of the meal, let them do that, and only step in to help them when they need it, and to make sure that you're using one of the hand feeding techniques before you just spoon feed the person. That's what I typically see most often in practice. But when you do that, then you actually set up a scenario where you could create more disability for that person. So don't just sit down and take over. Try to work with them, and so that they're still engaged in the act of eating throughout the meal. And with Alzheimer's disease, you need to know that what they could do at breakfast, they might not be able to do it at lunch. So there's not only day-to-day variations in what they can do on their own, there's also meal-to-meal variation and within a meal. So it does take quite a bit of supervision and adapting your care based on what the person can do in the moment. But always trying to make sure that it's a social encounter and not like a task, like you need to eat because we've got to move on. You'll get a lot farther if it's a social interaction and you're sitting down and eating with them also. The second cue, the second point, is how to maximize independence for self-feeding, which I just kind of talked about a little bit, making sure that you offer the verbal and visual cues, only adding hand feeding assistance at the point in the meal where they need it, or maybe you need to give them a little bit of overhand feeding to get them started, and then they can eat on their own. And the other thing to think about is if the utensils are too much for that person to manage, that it's okay to go with finger foods. And finger foods include things like sandwiches, ice cream cones, ice cream sandwiches, frozen yogurts, chicken nuggets, anything that could just be picked up with your hand and eaten kind of on the go. So that tends to work better for people that are either on a regular or a mechanical soft diet, but you could still do milkshakes or or smoothies for someone if they're on a pureed diet. So the third point are the hand feeding techniques. And there is a short video, there's a 10-minute podcast on the 3 different hand feeding techniques and the sensory changes that happen that impact the person's ability to feed themselves with Alzheimer's disease. And then there's a 3-minute video. Both of these are on my website, melissabphd.com/NOSH, NOSH. And these hand feeding techniques were created with the intention of helping somebody with Alzheimer's disease to eat more food, but they can be very helpful if someone has a tremor or has Parkinson's. It's just a way to provide them feeding assistance in a dignified way instead of just taking over and spoon feeding the person, which may make them feel, like they're being treated like a child. So I would encourage you to check out those, the hand feeding techniques, which are overhand, underhand, and direct hand feeding. And they're used for if someone has limited range of motion in their shoulder, their elbow, or their wrist. If someone has a tremor, maybe they have they aren't able to hold the utensils any longer. So these are your skill fingers, and you lose skill finger ability before you lose strength. And so if you just need to fill in the skill finger part for them, the underhand technique is a great solution for that. Or maybe they just have upper extremity weakness. Maybe they've had a stroke. Or they just don't have enough endurance to feed themselves the whole meal. And so please check out those 2 videos about how and when to use each of the hand feeding techniques, because that can be really helpful to get someone to resume eating on their own. In fact, we've had a lot of people that are not people in my studies had not fed themselves for like a year or 2, and we start using the hand feeding techniques with them, and all of a sudden they're feeding themselves again. So so just be mindful of that. And then when you're using the hand feeding techniques, or you're going to assist someone at all, make sure that you sit on the dominant side of the person that you're helping. That way, any assistance that you provide is coming from the side of their body that they're used to feeding themselves. Making sure that you tailor to the amount of support that they need in the moment, and then promoting them feeding themselves as much as possible. So if you are working with maybe a relative who's been in a facility for a while, and the kind of usual care that the staff do is just to sit down and do spoon feeding, that might be what they're used to. And so you may have to do the different hand feeding techniques more than one time over time to get them used to these techniques being used. But at the end of the day, you want to start with overhand and then move to underhand, and you save direct hand, which is slightly different than spoon feeding because you have to take into account the visual changes that happen. But you want to save that for last. And so again, just go back to melissabphd.com/NOSH and OSH, and there's a 10-minute version and a 3-minute version demonstrating the differences in the different hand feeding techniques. And with that, we conclude part 4 of our 4-part series around Alzheimer's care and swallowing. So thank you for tuning in, and drop me a comment if you have other questions about Alzheimer's care or would like for me to talk about any other topic related to aging or age-friendly initiatives or ageism. Thank you for tuning in to This Is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review, because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast and helps us move towards an age-friendly world. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.